Hey everybody, welcome to Blueprint, and this video is going to talk about the South Asian health evolution. How our ancestors were exposed to dozens of different famines under the British colonial regime, and how that has impacted our physiology and has actually pushed us into a very, very big issue that sometimes gets overlooked within the community, within the South Asian community when it comes to our health. And that's understanding our predispositions and what they are pushing us towards when it comes to chronic diseases and what we are experiencing in terms of health, not only limited to what's going on over in South Asia and around the India area, but how people have migrated from there to other countries all over the world, especially here in North America. So we're going to talk about biology, adaptation, and modern cardiometabolic risk. So the main core evolutionary premise is that our ancestors' bodies were exposed to dozens and dozens of famine, and that famine adaptation is now living within our bodies in a world of abundance. You could make the case that most Indians, most South Asians across the globe really aren't living in the same times that they were before, where famines would be very, very prevalent and would significantly impact not only the health of the people that were able to survive, but also kill off millions and millions of people due to lack of resources, lack of food, and not any help from the British government, which was in charge of India in and around that time. So our bodies, over the course of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, have basically survived based on the famines that they were exposed to. So survival was optimized during famine time. And during this time, there were significant droughts, there's significant lack of food. Even though food was available, people couldn't afford it because of what they were exposed to, which led to our bodies having to adapt to get through these tough times when food was scarce and these famines occurred, whether they were forced upon us or whether they were naturally occurring. It's a combination of both. There's a really, really good book. I highly recommend you try to check it out. I pulled some of these notes from the book, but also sharing a lot of my experiences and doing deep dives into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers on South Asian biology, health, fitness. So this is called Healing from Our History, How Colonial-Era Famine Led to Modern South Asian Health Crisis by Dr. Mubin Syed. So he brings to light a lot of these issues. So it's talking about what our bodies had to go through and how they adapted to survive these famines at that time. It also does not account for the predispositions that have been seen from studies that have been published looking at bodies that have been uncovered going back 10,000 years. So with that, in my experience working with thousands and thousands of different people, we kind of already know in general, there are going to be outliers, so I'm not talking about them, but in general, the bodies of South Asians are significantly smaller than any other ethnic group across the globe. Smaller in size and stature, smaller in bone breadth, bone mineral density, smaller amount of muscle mass. And with that comes a host of a lot of problems and issues if you don't take the right steps to right the ship, so to speak. So going back to what our bodies had to encounter and go through to get through these famines. So again, bodies that have to survive through famine aren't going to have a lot of mass to them. They're going to have more fat mass. They're not going to have a lot of muscle mass. Bone mineral density, skeletal mass size is going to be very, very minimal because you're not getting in the appropriate nutrition. You're not getting in enough calories. You're not getting in enough vitamins and nutrients, especially from a micronutrient perspective. So when the body isn't getting enough, you're going to have some adaptive thermogenesis that initially happens, and over time, that's just going to wear down on the body. So you're going to have a reduced caloric need. You're going to preserve blood glucose levels. You're going to conserve sodium, especially during times of drought and lack of sodium intake. But now, our bodies are not experiencing, we don't have to go through famines. Now, basically, for most people across the globe, you have easy access to food, ultra processed food, food that you didn't necessarily have with our ancestors. So we now live in a time of moderate abundance, and you have these same traits, lower resting metabolic rates, higher levels of blood glucose, issues with dealing with sodium that are experiencing this in the modern world. So it increases cardiometabolic disease risk. So again, a classic case of evolutionary mismatch. You have the same biology, but now you're in a different environment. So moving on to the next main theme is central fat storage and hormonal dysregulation. So visceral dominance and adipokine abnormalities. So a lot of people are now talking more and more about visceral fat. So when we talk about fat, it's distributed in and around the body in a variety of different areas. You have subcutaneous fat, which lives under the muscle. You have intramuscular triglycerides, IMTG, which are in the muscles. And then you have fat that gets positioned and sits in and around the organs. And we call that visceral fat, viscerally. I mean, there's fat around the heart, everywhere, in small amounts. But when you live in this era of abundance, when you're in a caloric surplus, your energy expenditure is very low, what ends up happening is you have an excess amount of energy and it's going to store in the form of fat. So South Asians preferentially store fat centrally, viscerally, in and around the abdomen. Now, one unique thing that I've been able to recognize from measuring and working with thousands of athletes of different types of bodies is there is a very unique anthropometric characteristic when it comes to South Asian bodies. Now, generally, we have longer trunks compared to our lower limbs. So a simple measurement that can tell you what your ratio is just the seated height. What percent of your body is trunk and what percent of your body is legs. Now, anything greater than 50% in terms of trunk means that, you don't have the longer limb lengths in the lower body, and you have an elongated trunk, which allows for more fat deposition because you have more surface area around that area. Now, what's also very common among South Asians are that you have longer limbs. So if you've ever noticed this, it's very prevalent. Now, I'm someone who's about 5'10", my wingspan is 6'2". Now, very advantageous for sports, certain sports, but not advantageous for trying to develop a lot of strength and power when it comes to horizontal and vertical pressing, and the same thing when it comes to pulling motions. That makes it a lot more difficult. To go along with that, you have narrower bone breadths. So anybody that's ever been measured up, trying to wear a watch, or measure your wrists, or measure at the elbow, and even measure at the knee, and even at the hips, generally those numbers are going to be significantly shorter and smaller than most other ethnic groups. So when we're talking about where on the body can you distribute fat, it's going to be minimal around the arms because South Asians tend to have longer arms. They're narrower, so you don't have the same volume and surface area capability of putting on muscle mass, especially with muscle site attachments being less advantageous when it comes to showing and developing more muscle mass. So that just means you're not able to store as much fat, subcutaneously within the muscle. So a lot of it tends to depose in and around the midsection. So we look at two simple measures, android, gynoid. Android means you're more apple-shaped, gynoid means you're more pear-shaped. And those numbers skew very much higher when we're talking about looking at, the biology and physiology of South Asians. So higher amounts of visceral fat. So visceral fat is an issue because it's not passive. It's pro-inflammatory. It's constantly secreting the inflammatory adipokines that are not ideal for overall health. So what happens? It worsens insulin resistance. It is metabolically active and hormonally disruptive. It drives systemic inflammation and it amplifies cardiometabolic risk. So the only way that you can actually quantify how much visceral fat you have is you have to get the appropriate type of scan. A DEXA is the easiest one that's universally accessible for almost every single person, especially here in North America. You can use Instalab, you can use DexaFit, you can use BodySpec, you can use FitNessity, you can go to Google Maps and type in DEXA, DEXA, and try to find a place around you because it's more prevalent that these pieces of equipment are being used in wellness and prevention as opposed to what they were initially created for, which is just specifically for imaging purposes, looking at bone mineral density. I've been using DEXAs for decades with elite athletes, so knowing this is really, really important. And the general number you would want to try to get down to is less than 250 grams of visceral fat. Even better would be below 150, but anything above that is going to drive your risk for having an associated increased risk for chronic disease. Now, moving on to adipokine abnormalities, most South Asians have low adiponectin. So higher amounts of adiponectin normally improve insulin sensitivity, which is very, very crucial within our population. Lower levels worsens insulin resistance across the board. On the flip side, you actually have higher leptin and higher resistin. So the highest resistant levels of any ethnicity promotes obesity and insulin resistance simultaneously. So what does that net effect have with lower adipokines? Adiponectin and higher resistant is fat tissue actively reinforces metabolic dysfunction, especially as it accumulates viscerally. Now, the next is talking about this thin fat phenotype, which they actually call in the literature the South Asian phenotype, which is kind of a kick in the nards, if you tell me. And all it basically is low amounts of muscle mass compared to height and body weight. And what does that actually do to somebody? What are the consequences metabolically? And they're pretty significant. So it is called the South Asian phenotype. So South Asians have the lowest lean muscle mass of any ethnicity. And again, I'm not trying to be mean. This is the truth. And there are outliers. I'm definitely one of them. But this is the reality of what our people have to face. And there are significant consequences of having a low level of muscle mass. So when you look at the typical South Asian, for males, you see smaller chests. They're not super broad. And I happen to be very, very wide up top. I wear size large shirts easily, size 40 or 42 suit jacket, even with the long arms. But that's not generally the case. So when you look at and you think of that South Asian body, you think, somebody that has very, very long and thin arms and has this massive pot belly. It doesn't spring out too much. It just generally just sits in and around the midsection. As I told you before, one of the reasons is we've got shorter lower limbs and an elongated trunk. And with that, you store more fat centrally. You have that low amount of muscle mass, and then you have this thin fat phenotype. And because of what our ancestors had to deal with during the famine eras, evolutionary logic says muscle is very metabolically expensive, it's highly metabolically active, it requires more calories than fat to maintain. So a lower amount of muscle mass improved famine survival. So that was true, over the course of almost 200 years. But even going back further, when you look at what the data shows of what they've dug up and looked at when they've studied and measured these bones of our ancestors going back 10,000 years, they're still smaller. So it doesn't mean that, they may have been smaller but had a significantly higher amount of muscle mass. That's not necessarily true. So when we look at the South Asian phenotype and what happens during modern day times and what the consequences are, well, when you have less muscle mass on your body, you have a decreased ability to utilize glucose. More muscle mass is one of the biggest crucial points that any South Asian needs to think about when it comes to changing or quote unquote optimizing your body to become healthier, to become metabolically healthier. It's like one of the first steps you should think about addressing. And lower amount of muscle mass, also reduced metabolic flexibility, and higher insulin demand for the same glucose load because you don't have the opportunity to clear it out as much. And there are obviously other controllable lifestyle factors that, our people don't really engage in that can help out with that. So that's another kick in the nards. And you can't just go to your doctor and figure this out because traditional, modern, Western medicine does not account for all the things that we have been exposed to and we go through and deal with on a daily basis. You go to your annual physical, it's probably a waste of time. I'm going to tell you that right now. They're only going to look at a very small number of labs. They'll get your height, they'll get your weight, and say, oh, I'm going to calculate BMI. But South Asians show up normal on BMI, but still have significant issues with the composition of their bodies. And the only way you should really dive deep into figuring out, the weight on the scale does not mean anything. Because you can show up with a normal BMI. BMI is just weight in kilograms over your height in meters squared. And most South Asians are presenting, 250 to 300 plus pounds, like some normal Americans are, which is becoming the norm, here in North America. So your normal BMI can still mean severe metabolic risk because you are highly under-muscled. Your bone mineral content is very low, and you have too much body fat, but you don't necessarily look like you have 30 to 35 to 39% body fat, but I've got data on dozens and dozens and dozens of clients that prove the otherwise. And their body weights are not high. Only a very small handful are over 200 pounds, and the majority are in and around the 170 to 190 range. And again, anywhere from 27 to 39, sometimes even 40+% body fat. And when they get that information, so the first time they generally have ever seen it, and they're starting to comprehend it, it's very, very, very humbling, as it should be. Understanding where you're at, being more self-aware is the first step into trying to propel yourself into making specific changes. So at this same weight, we are more metabolically sicker at the same weight in BMI as any other ethnicity. It's because there's a significant lack of muscle on our bodies. The next is talking again, what I introduced before, metabolism and energy efficiency. So resting energy expenditure and fat oxidation during exercise. So what's been reported, South Asians have significantly lower resting metabolic rates, and this is easily seen. The tough thing is when you're trying to figure out, okay, based on my height and my weight and my age, how many calories do I burn? I can say I work out X number of days per week. I generally get in X number of steps. You can use these free calculators that basically use the Harris-Benedict equation, Mifflin-St. Jeor, but the problem is those equations were created using the bodies and the physiology of non-South Asians, and they're typically larger, have more muscle mass, and you're getting a wrong result. So one of the best ways to quantify what your true and actual resting metabolic rate is to go get your RMR tested. So you need to use a metabolic heart gas exchange at the mouth, and that's going to give you a number. And what's I've typically seen with South Asians that end up doing this is based on what you would normally see through calculations, anywhere from, and it varies, 10 to 25% lower resting metabolic rate than what gets spit out or what would be calculated from using one of these equations, Mifflin-St. Jeor, Harris-Benedict. What some pieces of evidence say could be up to 30%, 32% lower resting thermoneutral energy expenditure versus Caucasians. That's significant. That's no joke right there. And again, this is driven by a higher amount of fat. Fat burns fewer calories than muscle. It's not, in exorbitant amount day by day, but when we're talking about 10 to 20 pound shifts, that number adds up over time, months, weeks and months. And there's a significant lower amount of lean mass. So back then, going through those dozens and dozens of famines, that was an advantage because you didn't need as many calories to survive because you didn't have as much muscle mass. But now it's a massive liability. So moving on to what's happening with energy production, cellular respiration at the cellular level. Well, at the cellular level, South Asians generate more energy from the same glucose input, have highly efficient mitochondrial metabolism, and conserve calories at rest even without activity restriction. So this caloric conservation trait was critical in recurring famine cycles across the subcontinent. Now, when we talk about moving on to exercise, so fat oxidation during exercise is up to 40% less burn fat during aerobic exercise versus other ethnicities. And that's definitely a big, big issue when we're talking about improving cardiovascular health and fitness in aerobic capacity and improving energy expenditure, increasing fat max. If we're already down 40%, that means you have to work harder to get the same results as somebody else that doesn't have to work as hard. So on average, we've lower VO2 max and lower aerobic exercise capacity and lower energy expenditure at the same workload and an impairment in fat oxidation. And this doesn't just persist at very, very low intensities, talking about zone 2 and zone 3. As you continue to trend upwards of zone 4 up to zone 5, that still stays the same. So ultimately, we would want to be very efficient with our cardiovascular health and fitness and not have to accumulate a significant amount of lactate and have an impairment in the ability to clear it out to be able to utilize as much fat as possible at higher intensities and preserve glucose, preserve muscle glycogen, because that's only an advantage when it comes to exercise performance. But we don't actually have that. So again, based on our physiology, because of everything that has happened with the famines, with our predispositions, going about 10,000 years, we have to work harder to get the same result as any other ethnic group out there, which is a problem because most people don't realize that. So what this means, cardio alone is less effective for fat loss in South Asians. The number one thing every South Asian should do when it comes to trying to get in shape or trying to go through some kind of health transformation protocol is prioritize resistance training first. Not to say cardio is important. I love cardio. I do both. But knowing this information, having this data, and being able to put together a tailored plan, resistance training is first. So it's just the number one thing that can and should be done. So standard exercise, energy expenditure calculations overestimate actual burn. I've already mentioned this too. So I've actually got an RMR done, and based on standard calculations, not considering South Asian, and based on the amount of muscle mass I have, I'm within a very, very small percent of what would be calculated. But that's from putting in the time and effort and work to building up a good amount of muscle mass and strength, which has been very, very meaningful in my health, my performance, and being very, very elite in both of those categories. So our bodies burn less energy than others at rest and during exercise. So building up muscle mass burns more energy at rest. Increasing your cardiovascular fitness, doing your conditioning, improves energy expenditure during exercise. So the combination of both are really, really important, but resistance training can and must come first because our physiology reinforces fat storage even with regular physical activity if you don't account for the need to have to work harder, which is what we have to do. So now moving on to insulin resistance, beta cell reserved. So these issues are not just showing up in people that are 30, 40, 50, 60 years old. It's kind of programmed early, the second we are born. And it's not only lifestyle induced, it's exacerbated by poor lifestyle, which a lot of Indians have, a lot of South Asians have. So insulin resistance reduces glucose uptake by muscle preserving blood glucose for brain survival during the famine. So you don't get to eat enough food. You want to preserve the blood glucose that you have. So you drive up insulin resistance to be able to account for that. So it reduces glucose uptake by muscle, preserves blood glucose for the brain, and it redirects excess glucose to fat storage. That's a big issue. So back then that was more of a survival mechanism. Now it's a big, big problem. So it's programmed into our DNA as a survival state. So even comparing ourselves, young, healthy adults, what are those fasting insulin levels look like compared to Europeans? They're 2 times higher. Some of it has to do with evolutionary programming. Some of it has to do with poor lifestyle. Some of it has to do with low movement. Some of it has to do with low muscle mass. And a combination of all of it is why we're seeing issues happening at younger ages than we've seen in previous generations. Even looking at newborns, the data show that higher insulin levels in the umbilical cord, lower birth weight, but higher body fat percentage. I can count the number of conversations I've had with parents in my generation that have had very, very small babies, boys and girls. And the higher insulin levels, that has to do with the health status, obviously, of both parents, but what's going on maternally throughout gestation. And if you already had these issues heading into conception, they're not magically going to solve themselves. So the issues that the parent has, passing it down to their kids. So the poor kids, coming out of the womb already at a disadvantage. So insulin resistance is programmed early. It's not just a consequence of lifestyle alone. We know that. So some have this theory about beta cell physiology. So beta cells are in the pancreas. That's what produces insulin. So South Asians have the lowest beta cell reserve of any ethnicity. This is true. So evolutionary logic, during famine time, the body needs very little insulin. Lower insulin production conserves energy. Fewer beta cells equals less maintenance costs. So the body's like, okay, well, we're going through these famines. I don't need to produce as much energy. I need to conserve it. So let me kind of tell the beta cells to shut off, calm down. We need very, very little insulin. That was fine back then, but we do have an issue now. So modern consequences, limited ability to compensate for insulin resistance. You have earlier beta cell exhaustion and failure, potentially due to a limited number compared to others. Faster disease progression. So you have insulin resistance, which is a big deal, a big issue. And then pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes alone. So this is why South Asians develop diabetes much, much earlier than other ethnic groups at a lower BMI with lower apparent risk on standard calculators. Because what happens is a lot of times nothing really flags with your weight. So you don't have a high BMI, which would normally, something might happen at the doctor's office, say, oh, you're overweight or you're obese, class 1, class 2, class 3, whatever it is. Let's dive a little bit deeper to see what's going on. They might even ask you more about symptoms and things that you're experiencing. The unfortunate reality is your doctor doesn't have enough time to navigate and get through all those different areas. So you might even get to that part, even if you presented with issues. The second is you might just look at a fasting glucose. South Asians generally tend to sway a little bit higher. Even I do. I've done my genetic reports, and even being super lean and insulin levels are super low, HOMA-IR is below 1, that's something I'm going to have to deal with and account for. You might get an A1C. An A1C lags. So because they're not measuring fasted insulin levels, blood insulin levels, and they don't use the appropriate ranges, you might be 10 to 12. And the doc looks at it, oh, standard reference ranges, you're good. 10 to 12 is astronomically high and a big problem because you need to calculate HOMA-IR. Fasting glucose times insulin divided by 405. If you're over 1, if you're over 1.5, you better start doing something about it, because if you don't, it's not magically going to creep down. It's going to continue to go up and up and up. And to understand where is the issue arising from, you could also potentially get C-peptide tested. That's what I do for a lot of the Indians that I work with, to show insulin, glucose control, everything isn't just limited to 1 or 2 markers. It's kind of looking at everything as a whole to figure out what seems to be the issue and what can and should be addressed. Moving on, cardiovascular, systemic risk factors. So this is sodium sensitivity, LPA, epigenetics. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about because this is not only the number 1 killer of everyone across the planet, but it is the number 1 killer of South Asians. So talking about salt sensitivity, why there is this issue. So drought adaptation, enhanced sodium retention for survival. But there was also salt scarcity along with lack of food across much of the subcontinent historically. So British colonial salt tax enforced salt restriction across generations and harsh penalties for salt harvesting. So the result is you have this enhanced sodium avidity plus an increased salt sensitivity, which is kind of genetically encoded. This doesn't mean that you can't have salt or sodium. I've tested my genetics and I do have an issue with it, but I think there is a massive overblown proportion about the connection between sodium and hypertension, high blood pressure. Most of the medical community will say, oh, you've got hypertension or you're pre-hypertensive, you need to cut out salt. Well, that in and of itself isn't going to solve the problem. One of the biggest issues is the overconsumption of carbohydrates, especially refined carbohydrates, very, very poor quality food, ultra-processed food, which in and of itself drives heart rate and blood pressure independent of sodium consumption. But we also need to look at what plays a role with fluid getting into the cell, out of the cell. It's sodium, potassium, magnesium. The average South Asian is not eating enough potassium. The average South Asian is not eating enough magnesium. And all three, including sodium, play a specific role with maintaining fluid balance and that osmotic pressure within the vessel. Now, one of the easiest things without adjusting sodium intake is, one, stop eating crap food. Stop eating an excessive amount of carbs. Hydrate, drink more water, increase your intake of potassium and magnesium. And that in and of itself can be a very, very nice starting point to improve what might be seen as an issue with sodium and or elevated blood pressure. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance behind it. There are a variety of different things that can and should be done to maintain a healthy blood pressure, because being normotensive is very, very important. That's why measuring blood pressure is one of the 5 metabolic syndrome risk factors. But even someone like myself, knowing this is what our ancestors went through, this is kind of predisposed to us, but also looking at the genetic SNPs and having an issue with sodium sensitivity, you would think, oh, this guy probably doesn't eat any sodium at all. Well, that's not true. I do an electrolyte packet every day. I salt 2 of my meals pretty intensely. I do not count sodium or anything like that. And last time I checked my BP when I donated blood, it was 90 over 56. So knowing what to do is more important than just freaking out over a single biomarker or number. But the average South Asian is definitely not doing that. So that's why more concerted effort and context is needed. So knowing that we have these issues with sodium, what are these modern outcomes? Well, you have hypertension at lower salt intake thresholds. That's a predisposition, but you have a lot of controllable lifestyle factors that are not being addressed, which elevates your risk for chronic kidney disease. That in and of itself, in dysregulated blood glucose levels, are going to raise it too. Elevated stroke risk and prolonged blood pressure elevation after exercise. So obviously, it's one of the stressors that the body goes physiologically. When you exercise, cortisol is elevated, blood glucose levels go up, heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up. And that's totally normal. It's exactly what we want to have happen. But you would want the body to recognize the stressor and have the mechanisms to get you back to homeostasis as quickly as possible. So again, we look at certain markers, heart rate recovery, making sure that blood glucose levels do drop back down, heart rate does drop back down, HRV goes back up, and blood pressure normalizes. But if it stays elevated much longer after training, much more so than you would expect, much more so than anybody else, and that becomes an issue because that's a massive stressor that the body is being exposed to. So again, another one of those kicking the nards. The same sodium retention trait that prevented death back then by dehydration during the drought now raises resting blood pressure in this world of ultra-processed food, high sodium food, higher refined carbohydrates, higher refined fats, because that's predominantly what most people are eating. It's not just limited to Americans, but that's what's happening globally. So looking at LPA, so this was very unique. This is one thing that I learned from the book, The Historical Role of LPA. So during recurring famines, severe vitamin C deficiency was common. So the disease with that is scurvy. Because again, if you're not able to eat a variety of different types of foods, especially high quality plant-based foods, fruits, things of that nature, then yeah, your vitamin C intake is going to be very poor. So this is affecting 60 to 70% of the population in some regions. So the unique thing here is LPA is going to increase and go up. So LPA acts as a vitamin C analog, which is great because you need an antioxidant. Vitamin C is one of the main antioxidants that we consume and need in our body for a variety of different reasons. And LPA increased, so it acted in a way to help protect capillaries from rupture, improve wound healing. Obviously, vitamin C plus protein is very important in wound healing. Prevents bleeding in vitamin C deficiency. So back then it was protective. Now it's pathogenic. So you start seeing more people talking about things like ApoB, LPA, and going specifically away from just looking at total cholesterol or just LDL in a vacuum. So the issue now becomes 40 to 45% prevalence of elevated LPA in South Asians, what seems to be one of the highest globally. So the unique thing here is, even for someone like myself, every client that I work with, every South Asian that I work with, obviously LPA is on a panel. I haven't actually encountered somebody with an elevated LPA, and that actually happens with some of my other exec clients that are not South Asian. And, obviously there are a variety of different mechanisms. Don't even have to dive into medication. So being able to cut down LPA levels by 18 to 20%, some cutting it down from the 300s to the 200s. Obviously the next step will be the 100s, and obviously the next step will be getting it below 75. But for those that do happen to have LPA levels, well above 75, that becomes an issue because it drives atherosclerotic plaque formation. So an interesting statistic, and this is in the literature, South Asians make up 25% of the world's global population. South Asians also make up 50% of the world's atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease cases. So that's a big, big issue right there. So high LPA promotes clotting and thrombosis, increases early heart attack and stroke risk significantly. And when you look at, the insulin resistance, the poor glucose control, the elevated blood pressure on top of potentially being predisposed to having higher LPA levels, like you're just throwing napalm on a fire. You're just stoking it and making things worse and worse and worse. So they say LPA is not modifiable through diet or exercise, genetically determined, but that's not actually the case. And I've got evidence to prove that. So, traditional medicine will say you have to do certain things. Obviously, there are a couple of medications that are very popular and very prevalent, but there are other things that can be done to bring it down. And I have the evidence to prove it. So, looking at epigenetics, so how does our environment, turn on, turn off some of these predispositions, some of these alterations in our SNPs? So it's multi-generational disease amplification. So starvation induces heritable gene expression changes that persist across generations, independent of nutrition in the current generation. So evidence from famine cohort studies. So it's not just what has been studied over in South Asia, but what has actually been seen across different populations across the globe, in Ireland, different parts of Europe, other parts of Asia. So offspring of starved parents show increased diabetes risk. This is one thing that's been shown in our population. Grandchildren show elevated hyperglycemia rates, strike two. Cardiovascular mortality elevated across 2 generations. So it doesn't have to happen that the issues that our ancestors went through during these famines, you might say, well, it's only been, a couple hundred years. It hasn't been a millennia. But what they found from these cohort studies is it doesn't take a millennia for these issues to show up within the next generation. It's happening, within 1 to 2 generations. So everything that, our ancestors went through during those famines in South Asia is now showing up in our populations today. People of my generation, my parents' generation, and now we're starting to pass that off to our kids. So that becomes an issue. So when we look at it from a South Asian context, look, repeated famines across centuries equal repeated epigenetic reinforcement cycles. And it doesn't take 1,000 years. It only takes a couple hundred. So these signals persist even when the current generation has adequate nutrition today. Well, yeah, most of us could say we're in a much better state than, my parents were in a much better state than what my grandparents or even my great-grandparents were. So you inherit not just the genes, but their metabolic responses to scarcity. So the environment has changed, the biology has not been able to catch up. So how do all these factors converge into a unified disease picture? And what I will say is we have some of the worst health habits, but we also have some of the worst predispositions that have been imposed on us, whether, we deserve them or not. And it's up to us to educate ourselves, become self-aware, and do something about it, because you absolutely can do something about it. I'm proof positive of it. There's nothing special about me. So what do we look at when we're talking about this integrated risk profile? Highest global coronary artery disease rates across the globe, highest diabetes prevalence worldwide, highest chronic kidney disease and stroke rates. I already talked about atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Disease onset occurs not only at lower BMIs than other populations, it's now happening in younger ages. People are getting heart disease decades earlier than you would anticipate. Normally you would anticipate somebody in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now it's happening with people in their 20s and 30s. Problem is there's a low apparent risk on Western calculators. Like I said before, modern Western medicine does nothing for South Asians. It does not do a damn thing for us. So why standard tools miss it? Well, those risk calculators were calibrated on European populations. In the same vein I told you about energy expenditure calculations from Harris-Benedict, Mifflin St. Jeor, they were used, kind of European Anglo populations for their calculations. They don't think about what is different and unique for the South Asian population, even though here in North America we're a small percentage of the total population. So what's the benefit? What's in it for them? So systemically underestimate risk for South Asians because our BMI thresholds are wrong. So disease is happening at 23, not 25. 25 is the cutoff for going from normal weight to overweight. Waist circumference norms are incorrect. So obviously, one easy thing to do is to check waist circumference. Really, anything over 34 or even 36 in terms of inches has been shown to increase your risk for disease. And obviously, men and women are going to be a little bit different. Women are going to have smaller thresholds than men. But when you look at the traditional population in terms of one of the 5 risk factors for metabolic syndrome in Western numbers, they say anything over 40 inches for men. I think it's 35 or 36 for women. But that number is significantly smaller for South Asians because we're smaller people. Traditional cholesterol panels miss LPA, ApoB, and obviously insulin resistant isn't a cholesterol number, but we can throw it into biomarkers. They aren't looking at fasting insulin. They're not calculating HOMA-IR. So normal labs are not the same as optimal. So I've spent well over a decade doing tens and thousands of draws to create, more standardized South Asian reference ranges, and not just what the 2 main labs here in the States are, Quest and LabCorp. They have their own reference ranges, but it's everybody within the population that is getting tested, and they create these reference ranges. And 90+% of people here in North America, here in the United States, are metabolically and cardiometabolically unhealthy. So creating reference ranges based on that doesn't make any sense, especially when the South Asian population is very different than them. So what we need is South Asian specific thresholds for a variety of different things. It's not just for biomarkers, it's for height and weight, it's for fitness, it's for all these main impactful biomarkers in labs and pieces of data that have a strong interplay when it comes to looking at health as a whole. So when we look at this mismatch framework, so South Asians, based on what our ancestors went through, not only from 1 to 10 millennia ago, but what our great-great-great-grandparents went through during those famines. South Asians are optimized for energy efficiency by decreasing resting energy expenditure, optimized for fat storage and preservation, not knowing when food was going to become abundant again or available. So it also coincides with lower muscle mass. Glucose conservation for the brain. Sodium retention, again, not knowing when water or the appropriate foods are going to be available. Low caloric output, reduced metabolic maintenance costs, and multi-generation family survival. So all of these were life-saving traits for millennia. Now they become disastrous if you don't do anything about it. So the modern environment demands energy dissipation and high output. We need a higher amount of muscle mass. And they say lean muscle mass. It's just muscle mass. Lean body mass is the term which packages everything underneath that, independent of fat mass. You want metabolic flexibility under food abundance. So the ability to handle your caloric load in eating the appropriate amount based on where your health status is and being aware of where you're at. You need glycemic control with the constant glucose supply, because look, ultra-processed food isn't going anywhere. It's everywhere. It's globally. But your body has to be able to handle that. In the same vein, someone like myself, they're like, well, you probably don't eat carbs. You must watch that. I'm like, I don't even think twice about it. I probably eat, I know I do high, medium, low, but on a high day, I'm eating 400 grams of carbs. And my A1C is 5.0. My HOMA-IR is like 0.8. And no issue there. Modern environment demands low sodium environments. That one I'll put a little bit of an asterisk by, where there are other things to prioritize outside of, I've got to drop my sodium intake. And like, there are a lot of other important things that you need to do to make sure that you're moving in the right steps of taking care of your health. High activity and movement throughout the day. This one is a massive, massive one. The data show there is a significant amount of inactivity across all ethnicities within the South Asian population. And when people have free time, we call it leisure time, they are not engaging in physical activity when you have time to do something outside of work and family obligations, which obviously are the 2 biggest priorities hammered into us within the culture, and education if you are going through school. Single generation adaptation. So if we can fix it now, people of my generation, our parents' generation's cooked. There's nothing that can be done about that. My generation and the next generation, subsequently, potentially the one following up, will not have to deal with the negative consequences that we are experiencing right now at earlier ages. Because again, same biology, opposite demands. We have the ability to do it, but the question is, are people willing to do what needs to be done? That I don't know, but I'm not going to stop trying. So South Asians are not metabolically weak. You know, we're metabolically conservative, we're energy efficient, we're exceptionally famine adapted. I don't know if that's something that we really want to pat ourselves on the back for, but look, these traits become very dangerous when food is constant, which is how we live in our modern day worlds, in our environments. Sugar is all over the place, and movement is optional for the average person. Before, my parents' generation, it wasn't. Grandparents' generation, it wasn't. But my generation and the next ones, movement has become optional. But when we look at it from a South Asian health perspective, it is not optional, it is essential. So, just wanted to create this video to kind of talk about some of the predispositions that we go through and we face when it comes to our health, and how it explains a lot about why we are the way we are, but also what is it that can be done to let us thrive in this new, abundant, modern day 2026 world lifestyle, to get us from being one of the most unhealthy populations across the globe to making the right choices and taking the right steps in the right direction.